Hi YouTube, this is Just a Thought. Slavery never ended. Let me explain. The following is only speculation. Slavery is just one of the many tools and tactics used by elites. To them, it is no more than just a business model. That being said, let's zoom into the application of this model that I am most familiar with, early American slavery. It goes as followed. Invade lands, kill populating peoples, inhabit with a working class and slaves, then the production of cash crops. Before we break things down any further, let's establish our definitions of an elite and a slave for the thought process. An elite is an individual with old money or big money that views themselves above society and actively manipulates society with their financial pool. All this in the pursuit of power. One can also say that those with the same financial pool, whom turn a blind eye on humanity, belong in the same category. This is how it has always been throughout history. Big money backing church, government, or some other type of social structure in order to keep the unlimited wealth flowing. My definition of a slave is any man, woman, or child that is used by an elite, whether they are aware of it or not. Not to take away from the pain and suffering that comes from the traditional definition of the word slave, but what I mean to say is that elites see no color, if any, only green. It is important to remember that we are all just humans. We are all the same. There isn't actually an elite or slave race, just different mindsets and views of the world. Limiting the spread of knowledge was key to this barbaric system, and the elites and their forefathers have been very aware of this for a long time. Whites in the South couldn't be allowed to learn just how wrong and barbaric their day-to-day really was, and blacks couldn't be allowed to learn how to communicate or organize properly, or to even realize their own humanity. The idea was keep the whites dumb and mean and the blacks dumb and helpless. Ever heard the term divide and conquer? They had one feeling like a superior being and the other feeling animalistic, when in reality, we are all the same. Let's take a look at what happened by the 1860s when public schools had been widely established across the northern states, excluding the southernmost slave states, which seems to be their attempt at making another class of slave in the north, the industrial capitalism slave. Sure enough, with just a little bit of education and structure, the whites in the north realized their evil, many of whom couldn't stand idle anymore. Hence, the peak of the abolitionist movement by the 1860s, aka the anti-slavery movement. Meanwhile, in the South, slaves are growing ever more frustrated with conditions. Just look at Nat Turner in 1831, for example. The man assembled a small militia of slaves and attempted to free other slaves at multiple plantations, slaughtering the whites that held them in the process. In an elite's perfect idea of the world, Nat Turner and every other slave would be so uneducated and dehumanized that they didn't care for freedom, a world where they didn't know what family was or religion, a world where they didn't comprehend the possibilities of rebellion or what they might reap should they be successful. But this isn't an elite's perfect world, no matter how hard they try to make it so. This is humanity's world. Let's imagine the elites, with their view from above society, saw all this happening and realized they could no longer blatantly and violently rule society in such a way, for the people would eventually unite and take the power back. I would also like to support this idea with the inventions of the early 1800s. That led to widespread connectivity and, of course, widespread knowledge and information, like the battery, telegraphs, photography, typewriters, and more. Before you know it, the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery, is passed in 1865. But there's a loophole. It abolishes all forms of slavery but penal labor, prison slaves. The 13th Amendment says this: neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. And just after the 13th Amendment was passed, privatized prisons became widespread and the new method for elites to practice slavery. It might look well disguised today, but not too long ago, all the way up to the 20th century, elites basically called plantations prisons and forced the prisoners to work them. Now that agriculture for the large part has been automated, they have the prisoners making more consumer goods rather than working the fields nowadays. I'm sure there are many tactics used to keep these slave factories, aka prisons, filled with able-bodied men that I haven't wrapped my head around, besides the obvious use of police brutality and just locking them up on lies. For example, marijuana prohibition. America was first introduced to cannabis hemp in 1606. Ever since, American farmers grew hemp that was used across multiple different products such as paper, lamp fuels, and ropes. In the 1700s, farmers were even legally required to grow hemp as a staple crop. Fast forward to the early 1900s when an influx of Mexicans immigrated to America, bringing the practice of smoking cannabis and sharing this practice with the blacks who they lived with in lower communities. Prohibition of cannabis started around the same time and was officially outlawed in 1970 by the Controlled Substance Act. They even stopped calling it cannabis and dubbed it marijuana in legal terms, the Mexican word for weed. This is only one of their strategies. The cycle they start when they started sending our men to prison is a hard one to beat, and this was done purposely. We see the mass effect of this cycle not only in our overpopulated prisons today, but in our black and brown communities as well. That's the end of the thought. Free your mind.